There is no mother's love in hell. Mother's love is something that properly belongs to heaven. For the word mercy, as in God's mercy, is the same Hebrew word that is also translated womb. And that belongs to a mother's domain, obviously. And therefore a mother's love indicates, it points us to the mercy of God, and properly that's a heavenly domain. A mother's love is something from heaven and will forever point us to an even more perfect mercy, a more perfect love, and that is God's. And so it is right for us to consider examples of godly motherhood, as we will today, and of which there are many examples in Scripture. Today, we want to turn to the mother of Samuel, Hannah. We talk about Hannah probably as much as any mother at all, because every time a child's dedicated, we model that after Hannah's experience. And I want to read one passage of Scripture from that whole chapter that tells the story, which will then tell just 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 20. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I asked the Lord for him. Now, there's a story behind that. There's a story of a woman who asked God for a child. I have to take you into a time when culturally there were some things that are foreign to us that we don't understand. In fact, we would disagree. The first of those idiosyncrasies, we can call, is that of polygamy. A man having more than one wife, polygamy. It was practiced in the Bible. In no place in the Bible did God recommend it, nor did God permit it. The only thing we see in the Bible is that God did not punish it. His standard was one woman, one man, Adam and Eve. Even Abraham, one wife. Isaac, one wife. It began to be a little different once Rachel and Leah came along in Jacob's life. But polygamy was a common practice which God never once approved, and it is as though the Bible itself is trying to appeal to our common sense. For every case that we see polygamy practice, we discover one thing: it doesn't work very well. It's so obvious. Don't be deceived by the television show, or they call it Sister Wives. In this passage, we're going to find out the true meaning. It's called rival wives. Rival wives. You can feel it. You don't need an explanation of that. God does not permit it. God simply didn't punish it so that we might see from the example of Scripture, as Romans 15 verse 4 tells us, that we might learn from the example of Scripture and realize, I'm not going to do that. The second thing, a cultural idiosyncrasy that we have to understand to get this story about this woman who prayed for a child, is the meaning of having children, childbearing. In this particular time in the world, in this particular culture, a woman's ability to bear children prolifically was synonymous with being attractive, desirable, even beautiful. If you wanted to prove your femininity, you didn't become the cover girl. You bore your husband a lot of children. Now there's a woman. She can bear a lot of children. She is a feminine woman. I mean, that is femininity. And so, in very real sense, a woman who did not have children felt ugly, undesirable. Nobody would want a woman who can't bear sons for a man. She felt ugly. And Hannah was such a woman. She did not have children, and so therefore this story begins. It's a journey of a good mother. The journey of a good mother is a journey with God, and that's what we'll find. We'll find here that this woman's dilemma of being childless drew her to God instead of made her bitter against God. She may have had some bitterness, but she didn't have it against God. It drew her to God. Here, this journey of a good mother was clearly a journey with God, and a godly mother's life is a journey with God. Mother's journey includes frustration with what life throws at you. She did not choose it. She was barren against her will. And as life moves on, you notice that there's more and more attention paid to children. Now, it happens, you might be married, and you're married, and at first, oh, you're a newlywed, it's a big deal, but when the first child comes along, you practically lose your name. You become so-and-so's mom, so-and-so's dad. And oh, you have a name besides your child's name. That I didn't know. You're just always so-and-so's mom. And we kind of like that. As a parent, both dad, I always liked being called Christina's dad, Joel's dad. It was a fine name for me. And I'm sure mothers feel the same way. In this case, Elkanah, a faithful Jewish man with his 2 wives, would go up every year to the center of worship, which was not yet Jerusalem. Here it was still Shiloh. Shiloh was the place they went. That's where the priests of the land lived, Eli, and that's where they would make the sacrifices. And it was a trip that they made. And on the trip, of course, you'd have to eat along the way. You'd have to have your food with you. And when you got to the area where the sacrifice, you had your big meal. And as it went down on this trip, there it would always come down to apportioning all the food. And obviously, the mother with all the children not only got more food, but also, and this might have been the real issue, got more attention from Elkanah. Oh, Elkanah loved Hannah just fine. In fact, to prove his love to her, he gave her a double portion of meat. Here, have 2 Whoppers. That's love, man. No, Elkanah, he was a romance. But obviously, where's he going to spend his time? He's cutting up the meat for the kids. Now eat it this way, softening up for the younger. He's got to be in there. There's all these children. And so his time is spent with the wife, with the children. And Hannah, it says, felt so alone. She felt rejected because the extra Whopper didn't really make her feel like she was loved. Elkanah did love her, but it just didn't help. It didn't work. It didn't make a difference. And so Hannah was obviously frustrated. She felt alone. She felt the years were marching on, so desperately wanted to have a children. If nothing else, it would change her status in the family. It would change her status with her husband, because her husband would then give her attention like he did to her rival wife. Oh, we think that children make life easier. Children hardly eliminate frustration. They're more likely to introduce it and infuse it into our lives, as it was here. But it got worse, because not only did she feel excluded, the rival wife, Peninnah, in verse 6, used the children as a tool for a competitive edge. Verse 6 says, and because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her. What does it say? To irritate her. Can you imagine that? 2 women trying to irritate one another? Impossible in this modern age in the Church of God here in Knox County. But out there, somewhere else, it actually happened. Provoked her in order just to irritate her. Look at my children, aren't they so cute? Oh, do you like the way my children eat? Isn't that cute? And just would provoke her, irritating her to the point where she wept so hard that she didn't even feel like eating both Whoppers. And I should get some advertising money from Burger King, don't you think, for having said it so many times? Were left untouched. She didn't care about the double portion of meat. Her heart was grieving. It hurt so bad. And comparing children and using children as a means of competition is simply wrong. Children are not there to make us look good. They're not there to prove our success. They aren't there for our sakes. And that Still happens. Comparing children between families, the same wickedness that was going on between Hannah and Peninnah. Nobody has the right to brag about their children, because you know what, in the end, have you noticed this? Children make up their own minds about how they're going to turn out. And there's very little that parents can say, I did that. I have known many parents who rear their children in such a way that one would expect a very different outcome than the irresponsible and sometimes faithless life that they're living. And we say, why? They made their own choice. And conversely, sometimes parents hardly did any real guidance that would substantiate the outcome, and here they are serving the Lord. Children make their own choices. And Peninnah used these small children who hadn't done anything and really hadn't developed into anything just to provoke and to use that as a competitive edge. Children aren't there to prove that we're superior. Using children to validate ourselves, using children to make us look good, using children to prove that we're successful, that is wrong, and it's an indication of a very insecure heart. It's very insecure when we need them to make us look good. She wanted to be a godly mother, Hannah did. She wanted that too, but it wasn't given to her. And so, many women who are waiting to have a child are not so comfortable when you start talking about how cute everybody's child is. And then it is even harder when we realize that some people get rid of the children, and here's a woman like Hannah who would say, please let me adopt them. I'll take your children. I'll take them. Well, frustration about children is without remedy. It's just a hard thing, and it's not even that a wonderful marriage can fulfill a woman who desires to be a mother. It was over-optimistic of Elkanah when he thought he could totally fulfill his wife's need. And you might laugh, but I'm reading from Scripture. Here's her husband would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you so depressed? Or it says downhearted. Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? Hold your laughter. I can only imagine her saying, no, you aren't. Or maybe it was, you should know how I feel. You should know what's wrong. But the truth is, a spouse cannot fulfill every desire that we might have, both ways. And it overtaxes the marriage when we expect the one to whom we are married to fulfill every possible desire. We're not made that way. God is alone sufficient. And to this woman who wanted to be a mother, no, Elkanah was not enough. But it goes further. When we expect that our children fulfill us and make us feel happy, feel fulfilled, it overstresses their capacity, and they crush under that load of trying to live up to their mother, their father's expectation. It doesn't work. That's not what they're made for. You know, everyone lives with unfulfilled desires. Hannah did. Women who are waiting on marriage do. Women who are waiting on children do. Everybody lives with unfulfilled desires in life, and that's the situation. But the story continues. A mother's journey requires even, fervent prayer, drawing close to the Lord and pouring out your heart. That's what happened here. It was at one of those times when her heartache was at its worst that she went to the Lord. What do you do when your heartache is so bad that you don't even know who to share it with? You have the opportunity to do what Hannah did. Hannah went into the tabernacle. She went there into that temple there where Eli alone saw her pray. She drew close to the Lord. And one of those times when maybe the family was eating, they were so busy with their meal that she slipped away. Well, Jesus Christ is the tabernacle. He is the one who brings us right to God, and you pour out your heartache to Jesus, He can do something about it. And so she went in. Only Eli the priest noticed her going in. She knelt down there, and she poured out her heart to God. She poured out her hurt. And you know, we can learn so much about ourselves and each other when we hear and listen to the content of prayer. We learn a lot about ourselves when we listen to what we're praying about. So let's listen in, because we're given the rare privilege of somebody's prayer in Holy Scripture, forever preserved, so that we might learn something. Her fervent prayer was for a child, of course, but first it had to do with the purpose for which she wanted a child. She prays, Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remembering and not forget your servant, but give her a son, I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life. Verse 11. The purpose was to give this child to God. Let me restate it. The purpose was to give the world a man who belonged to God. The purpose that she had for wanting a child was so that the world might be blessed with a man that lived for God. That's what I want to do. Whenever we dedicate children, using the story of Hannah, that is what you agreed to do, to give the world a woman, a man who belongs to God. And you're going to rear that child in such a way that that child lives to belong to God. How do you do that? You do it in the most practical ways. When I was a very small child and my parents were young parents, their pastor, long since deceased, taught the parents some simple things about how to rear a child so that they might know how to live for God. And it was in the area of tithing. Now, I won't have to give a tithing sermon this week if you'll remember this. He taught them that when you give your children allowance, which all the children said, yeah, our pastor told the parents to give us allowance, but it was 50 cents a week. It bought something back then. It really did. When you give them their allowance, say 50 cents, teach them, put a nickel of it in the offering plate. And from the beginning, they will learn to tithe. A simple thing. The income increases as time goes on. The tithe already is very natural. In that way, we were taught that even our finances, we belong to God in so many ways. Now, there's a whole lot more to it than that. But the point is, Hannah prayed and said, I want to give the world a child that belongs to you, God. That's the purpose. And then she said, and no razor will touch his head. That means he was going to have long hair. Now, that was not just a means of saying, I'd like to save about 20 bucks a month or 30 bucks a month on a haircut. No, this was called a Nazirite vow. A Nazirite vow would be taken when a person is on a particular mission for either God or country. And they would take the Nazirite vow, and you would know they're on some particular mission because their hair would grow and grow and grow. And when they finally got it cut, they got it done. And now, Hannah's saying, my son's whole life will be on a mission. And everybody will know it, because he bears the distinctive mark of a man who's on a mission for God. Now, Hannah had no idea, nor did she have in her mind, that he would one day be called to be a prophet of God. That comes much later. She just knew that she wanted to produce a child for the world who truly belonged to God and who was distinctively marked out so that everybody knew, my child belongs to God. Now, we live in an era when parents want their children to be happy. Hey, Hannah wanted their child to be happy, and the way we make them happy is we teach them how to fit in to the culture. How to look like everybody else, that's not a problem. How to act like everybody else, how to win at the worldly games, to fit in. And a mother who wants to give the world a child who belongs to God also teaches their child how to be different from the world, how to stand up and stand out for God when the world says, be like us and don't be any different than we are. We don't want you to be better than we are. A godly mother teaches her children how to stand up and stand out if need be, how to be different, because the mark of Christ on our life does make you different, and it does distinguish you. How do you help your children know how to do that? You teach them. You teach them. Well, the fervent prayer of Hannah was answered. Eli was the first one to assure her of it. She had no idea what all of this would mean. She had no idea that one day God would call Samuel to speak for him. No, that wasn't the point. Now, the mother's journey succeeds by being a faithful parent, not by producing remarkable children. Get that? A mother's journey succeeds by being a faithful parent, not by producing remarkable children. The children, they are like plants. They grow into what they're supposed to be if you nurture them, guide them, and do all the things that a faithful parent does. You cannot engineer your children into something spectacular if they are not that. You grow them. And so faithfulness is what's the order, not deciding, not the genetic engineering, not changing anything. Just grow them by being a faithful parent. And what did she do? Well, she brought them to the house of the Lord. And we talk about that. Let's talk about what it meant for Hannah. It meant that this is about after the child was weaned, which in that culture was sometime between 3 and 5 years. After the child was weaned, on one of those annual trips, they brought along little Samuel. Samuel was carrying a bigger suitcase than all the other kids, probably didn't know why. But they were going to have Samuel reared in the house of God. And that meant boarding school. Took Samuel by the hand and then came to Eli. Can you imagine this conversation? Eli, do you remember this woman praying there in the temple some years ago? There had been hundreds of people praying in the temple. I doubt that he remembered. Do you remember the sacrifice that we brought? You know, there had been thousands of sacrifices. He didn't remember which one that was. You remember the one who was praying for a child? Here he is. Suddenly, he's remembering and he's getting it. Oh boy. Now, Eli already raised his children. He is a grandfather now, and he didn't ask for it. And not only that, he was a grandfather who was charged to rear his grandchildren. I'm sure Eli and his old wife were overjoyed at this prospect that now they would be rearing and doing it all over again. But that they did. And they were a little bit better at being grandparents than they were at parents, it turns out. And he personally nurtured Samuel. He did go in the ministry. Now, Hannah was being a faithful parent. What do faithful parents do? Faithful parents bring their children to be reared in the house of God. We don't have a boarding school, but it does mean that you bring your children in contact with these adults, mature adult Christians who can invest themselves, speak into your children's life so that they might find role models in other families within the church and in that way be surrounded by witnesses for Christ. That's what it means. When we dedicate our children, that's what we're saying we're going to do. The Lord gave Hannah a son, and Hannah gave that son to God by rearing that child in the environment in which God can most likely get a hold of his attention. Now, there is no telling what God might do. Hannah did not have a preconceived idea of what Samuel would become. As it was, history will show that Samuel stood alone in all of history. He did something that is unparalleled in history in this. He led a nation to change their own change their self-government from a theocracy to a monarchy, and there was no bloodshed. Find somewhere in history where a nation changes their form of self-government without bloodshed, without a war. Samuel did that. It's remarkable in history. And he was reared in the house of God. Remarkable things can happen when you put the child in a position where God can reach them easily. That's what we're doing. Susanna Wesley is perhaps the epitome of motherhood. Susanna Wesley, of course, was the mother of both Charles and John Wesley. John Wesley, the evangelist, and his work eventually became the Methodist Church. And Charles Wesley, the prolific hymn writer. Our hymn book is full of hymns by Charles Wesley. Susanna Wesley was the mother of these two boys, and they were 2 of 18 children. They had not yet invented indoor plumbing, let alone electricity. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the household, the work, the order which she had to keep, the way she had to have a discipline in the home to which all the children complied? There's no other way. And what's remarkable is Suzanne Wesley in her journal writes that she found a time every week to spend with each child. And she wrote about those times. Sometimes a little tutoring, sometimes a little motherly nurturing. But Susanna Wesley found time each week for each child. 16 of the children are quite unremarkable. We don't know much about them. The goal of Suzanne Wesley was not to create remarkable children, though 2 of them were. She was a faithful mother. Brought her children to a place where they could most likely respond to God. And so being a faithful mother is the way a mother's journey succeeds. But a mother's journey concludes at the same fork in the road as is true with all human beings. That fork in the road that departs in 2 different eternal destinations is the question, did you follow Jesus? Did you follow Jesus? Yes, there is a special place for mothers, for there is the heart of God, the womb, the raham of God. There's a special place in heaven for mothers, but it's not an automatic place. It's not inevitable. No, each human being, every mother must come through Jesus Christ. Come to that place in the fork of the road where we say, Lord, I'm sorry I've sinned. I haven't deserved even the grace that I do know. And I definitely don't deserve a place in heaven except that you forgive me and claim me. That fork in the road will determine the difference between your eternal destinies, between heaven and hell. And there is a place. God has a place for every human being. His heart is so large that there's a place for you. There is certainly a place for every mother, but it's not an automatic place. You must make a decision. In just a moment, I'm going to ask mothers to come to these altars. Mothers and daughters, come to these altars and pray for your families. Pray for your nieces, nephews, children, grandchildren. And maybe you're a mom where you know that you're at that crossroads because when you die, it's too late. Now's the time to say yes to Jesus. And you can do that too. Would you stand with me?